Good morning, viewers. This is Ben Seattle for a video series I am calling The Century of Information War. This episode is titled, The Tweet is Mightier Than the Bone Saw. We begin with James Khashoggi, a Washington Post reporter who walked into the Saudi consulate in Istanbul earlier this month in order to pick up some documents for his wedding the next day. 2 minutes later, he was dragged into a nearby room, where a group of hard men began to cut him into parts while he was still alive and screaming. His killers appeared to be experienced at this kind of thing. When the screaming started, they put on their headphones and pumped up the volume. I've heard that classical music is soothing. Some background would be helpful. Khashoggi was well known and used to be the unofficial spokesman for the Saudi royal family. But the cards at the top got reshuffled, and Khashoggi had backed the wrong prince. So Khashoggi fled to the West for protection and for a voice, as a reporter for the Washington Post. Then the Twitter war started. That was when the shit hit the fan, so to speak, and Khashoggi got packed into suitcases. Khashoggi's killers started with his fingers. In the kingdom, if you write bad things, you lose your fingers. The killers came prepared, having brought with them a bone saw. Not everyone agrees that classical music is the best for cutting off someone's head. I favor drums myself, but hold that thought. I promise to get back to it.
In terms of dollars, $3 billion, $533 million, $525 million. That's peanuts for you. Should have increased.
The torture murder was ordered by Mohammed bin Salman, who is often known by his initials, MBS. After details of what MBS did to Khashoggi, however, he is now known as Mr. Bonesaw. We can learn a lot from the Twitter war that led to Khashoggi's murder. Walt Whitman once said that you can see the entire universe in a blade of grass. If this is true, then we can also see in this Twitter war the contradiction which will consume the attention of our current century, humanity's century of information war. The Saudis made use of a troll farm to dominate social media coverage of their country. This army of trolls was paid $3,000 a month each to support Mr. Bonesaw and tell lies about upstarts like Khashoggi. What could possibly go wrong? Saudi activists call this troll army the electronic flies. And instead of thinking defensively, they started up a volunteer army of their own they called the electronic bees. It became immediately clear that the bees would have no problem defeating the flies. The term information war is used to mean different things. Some use it to include things like the sabotage of computer systems. It is better if we think of it differently, as the online war of ideas, organized on a mass scale. That is what is happening today. Armies of humans, assisted by bots, are engaged in the online war of ideas and are learning to coordinate their activities on an increasingly larger scale. We are reaching a point where In this regard, we are beginning to see something new to history. Fasten your seatbelts. The Western press has run editorials suggesting that Mr. Bonesaw should be fired as leader of the Saudi kingdom. There has been speculation concerning who, quote, we, unquote, should select to replace him. Some Western editorials have even called for a constitutional monarchy in Saudi Arabia. There has not been much advocacy from within Saudi Arabia for a constitutional monarchy. The main reason for this is simple. Anyone who is foolish enough to advocate such a thing might be thrown into a crowded prison, overflowing with sewage, if they were lucky. If they were not lucky, their crucified bodies would be put on display in the public square. Start with a can of Coke. Shake it up really good. Now try to open it. That can of Coke is Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is key to the U.S. strategic control of the entire region. Saudi Arabia helps to prop up other reactionary regimes and promotes what is called stability, which is a term used to mean the repression of democratic movements, such as emerged throughout the Arab world in 2011 in countries like Egypt and Bahrain. Trump said that he wants to stick with Mr. Bonesaw because, quote, he keeps a lid on things. But the last time U.S. imperialism made such a show of support for a hated, murderous, so-called reformer in this part of the world, it was the Shah of Iran. The Shah had his soldiers shoot activists dead in the street. But the soldiers got fed up with this and instead shot their officers. The Shah was overthrown in 1979. A less repressive form of government in Saudi Arabia would be a big victory for the Saudi people, for the entire Arab world, and for the rest of humanity. What is holding this back? No one becomes king in Saudi Arabia without the approval of the ruling class in the U.S. Without U.S. protection, the entire Saudi royal family would be blown away in a sandstorm or end up like Gaddafi with bayonets up their butts. FDR, Roosevelt, who forged the U.S.-Saudi alliance, could have summed it up. They are sons of bitches, but they are our sons of bitches. Three years ago, Saudi Arabia launched a brutal war in Yemen, the poorest country in the Arab world. This war is part of Saudi Arabia's regional rivalry with Iran. As part of this war, Saudi Arabia has blockaded ports, created the biggest cholera epidemic in history, and put 14 million people at risk of starvation. Every 90 minutes, a Saudi-American airstrike is launched against Yemen, sometimes hitting military targets, and sometimes hitting marketplaces, hospitals, and school buses. A reasonable guess is that 50,000 people have been killed so far in this carnage. This war would be unthinkable without logistical and intelligence support and political cover from U.S. imperialism. From the point of view of imperialist interests, it is not that big a deal if tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or millions die. But the war has turned into a quagmire. There is no end in sight. That is why Yemen has started to hit the news recently. The war in Yemen like Mr. Bonesaw, may have become a liability. I think we can draw conclusions from all of this. First, the people who run the world are all basically ruthless killers. The main argument in the Western press for replacing Mr. Bonesaw as the chief U.S. lackey in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is that he is inept, reckless, foolish, etc. Such arguments are similar to the arguments made against Trump by the Democratic Party and sections of what is called the, quote, deep state. This term, the deep state, is a reference to the various institutions, formal and informal, which are part of the machinery of bourgeois class rule. These voices argue that Trump is an amateur who is in over his head and who is fucking up imperialist interests. The Democratic Party establishment parades itself, such as during the Supreme Court Kavanaugh hearings, as a bastion of decency and integrity, as opposed to the more racist, rapist culture of the Trump machine. The war in Yemen puts the lie to all this. The blockade, the starvation, the cholera, the bombings of marketplaces and school buses, the constant and uncontrolled wanton slaughter of the Yemeni people. This whole pile of barbarous war crimes began under the supposedly peaceful, sophisticated, and wonderful Obama. The second conclusion we can draw is that imperialism is not a policy. Rather, imperialism is an entire economic and political system, organized from top to bottom to serve the rule of capital. The Democratic and Republican establishments may squabble with one another, but they are cogs in an integrated imperialist machine, which works with skill and precision to keep humanity ignorant and enslaved. The ruling classes in other countries, such as Russia and Iran, are not any better and have the blood of 500,000 on their hands in Syria. All of these ruthless killers added together represent less than 1% of humanity. On the other hand, the overwhelming majority of humanity is opposed to this kind of imperialist war and senseless slaughter. But we don't rule the world. The ruthless killers do. Recent events are helping people understand that fundamental change is necessary. The third conclusion we can reach is that Twitter is more powerful than bone saws. The social weight, so to speak, of social media is increasing with every passing decade. It is as if the amount of oxygen in the atmosphere is continuously increasing. After a while, everything becomes combustible. The Saudis can hire an army of trolls, but experience is already showing that volunteer armies of ordinary people will inevitably emerge to defeat the trolls. The fourth conclusion we can reach is that the truth cannot be covered up forever. As the online wars of ideas deepen and develop everywhere, they will tend to interact with one another, sometimes merging, as the truth comes out. It will become clear, over the course of time, that there are two main class forces in contention. One side has the bone saws, the jet planes, the tanks, and all these other weapons. The other side, the international working class and the oppressed, will have numbers and the truth on their side. In an age of steadily increasing transparency and wars of ideas organized on a mass scale, victory will increasingly belong to the side that is based on the truth, which cannot be covered up forever. The truth about everything is emerging from the darkness, and nothing will be able to stop it. Karl Marx, in the Communist Manifesto, said, "Modern bourgeois society is like a sorcerer who can no longer control the demons summoned by his spells." No single sentence better describes the specter of social media, which announced its power to the world when it sparked the Arab revolts of 2011. At some point, a new kind of social media will emerge that uses genuinely democratic algorithms to connect millions. For those without a computer science degree, algorithms can be thought of as the little software robots that work to put shit, either good shit or bad shit, on your laptop or phone screens. Currently, these little software robots work to keep your eyes glued to the screen for the maximum number of hours per week, so that your attention can be captured and auctioned off as a commodity to advertisers who pay money for the right to manipulate your emotions and make you think you can be happy if you buy what they are selling. Or, in more simple language, these little software robots are designed to manipulate you, to shovel shit in your face hour after hour and make you want to come back for more. Democratic algorithms, on the other hand, don't work for the advertisers or the big platform companies like Facebook or Twitter. They work for you. You can modify these little robots or replace them altogether. You are in control. Once this new kind of social media emerges, millions will be able to use democratic algorithms to connect to one another and self-organize. At this point, the genie will be out of the bottle. This will lead to the moment when, as Karl Marx wrote, all that is solid melts into air. How much power will be unleashed when this happens? Power beyond imagination. Power beyond what was released that July morning in the New Mexico desert, when the mountains were lit by that terrible light, brighter than 1,000 suns. Sooner or later, change is coming. Change will not only come to Saudi Arabia, it will also come to their imperialist patrons here at home. Sometimes, when there is no other way forward, one event follows another like a row of falling dominoes. The puncture of one lie or illusion leads to the puncture of the next. The collapse of one institution leads to the collapse of the next. The pressure that has built up is too great. The dam is weakened. It breaks. Nothing can stop the flood. History strongly suggests that big change only happens in the context of revolution. Revolutions are often necessary, but they are also scary. During a revolution, people like Mr. Bonesaw, Mr. Trump, Mr. Obama, and Ms. Hillary would all go to the guillotine. So would people like Mr. Putin and Mr. Assad. I have no problem with any of that. The problem is that the list of who is fed to the guillotine might also be likely to include you and me, dear reader, because revolutions are violent and messy on a big scale.
We must give as good as we get. I demand 100,000 heads.
What is a revolution? It is hell breaking loose. It is fear and hope and pain. It is preemptive attacks, i.e., martial law and fascist death squads. It is preemptive attacks by the ruling class as the ruling class attempts to avoid extinction. And this is not the end of it. Revolution, based on history, generally tends to lead to a betrayal by treacherous forces which have gained power in the name of the people. So yes, of course, peaceful and gradual progress would be better if we have that choice. As we become conscious, we will understand what our real choices are.
This is not an invasion.
History has a tendency to unfold in such a way that men and women who are just attempting to survive and not be crushed are often left with no choice. I have mixed feelings about revolution because, as a student of history, I am aware that the first people killed are activists like me. Personally, I'm not affected. I am lucky enough to be old. I won't be around to witness the pain that is coming. But I know there will be other activists, more dedicated, more intelligent, more courageous than me, who will be here. They will say, "You can kill me, but 10 will take my place." I think humanity, and in particular their working class, needs clarity on the big questions. If we get rid of the rule of capital, then what will replace it? Can we really do better than what we have now? If so, how? The Russian and Chinese revolutions of the 20th century left in their wake progress, pain, and confusion. It is better to confront the big questions ahead of time, to the degree that this is possible. And for anyone who takes a look at the PDF, which is linked to this video, I have an appendix on this with the title, From Kronstadt to the Khmer Rouge. When King Louis XVI, the absolute ruler of France, assembled the Estates General to deal with the growing financial crisis, back when the United States was a young republic in 1789, few had any idea of where it would lead. 4 years later, Louis found himself standing before a crowd, his hands tied behind his back, next to the guillotine. He began to speak. What were his last words? No one knows. As Louis began to speak, the drums started up, drowning him out. That is why I say drums are the best. This has been Ben Seattle for the Century of Information, October 2018. And don't forget, if you liked this video, please show your support by liking or sharing it. Thank you.